Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Memorial Church. Thank you for joining us for this exciting event, this conversation. This is officially this year's Noble Lecture. The Noble Lecture is a 125-year-old tradition of this university and of this church. Nanny Yulee Noble endowed these lectures in memory of her husband, William Belden Noble, who attended Harvard College and briefly attended seminary. His dream was to become a minister, but he had poor health and died of heart failure at the age of 35. And having never been able to do the good that he wanted to do in the world, his widow endowed this lectureship to try to promote goodness. She said that these lectures should be as wide as the highest, their topics should be as wide as the highest interests of humanity. She wanted them to be as capacious and full and broad so as to welcome as many people as we could. And to that end, we have hosted many, many noble lecturers here at the church, professors and ministers and artists and filmmakers and activists and peacemakers. 2 senators and a president have been our noble lecturer. I think probably too many theologians have been our noble lecturer. But I think tonight is the first time we have had a Zen Buddhist priest as our noble lecturer, and we're very grateful to have Ruth with us. I'll introduce her in a moment, but first let me introduce Duncan Williams, who is going to be part of the conversation tonight. Duncan Ryūken Williams is Professor of Religion and East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Southern California and Director of the Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religion and Culture at USC. He also is a Buddhist priest in the Soto Zen tradition. He's the author and editor of several books, including most recently, and to great acclaim, the book American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War, which is a really beautiful book about the resilience and spirituality of Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. He will be joining me in conversation with Ruth Ozeki, who you are all here to see. Ruth is, as you know, is a New York Times bestselling author and a novelist whose books have received multiple awards, including most recently the Women's Prize for Fiction and a shortlisting for the Booker Prize. She's also a filmmaker, and in the past she's worked as a television producer, and she's a teacher, and she's, as I said, also a priest within the Soto Zen tradition of Japanese Buddhism. We're going to start with the reading. Ruth is going to come up here and offer a reading from her most recent novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness. And then after that short reading, we're going to sit at these chairs, and the 3 of us will have a conversation about her writing, about religion and literature, about her work. And then we will, after about 30 or 35 minutes, we'll open it up and take questions from the audience. At 7 o'clock, we'll invite you, if you'd like, to come into the memorial room where we have books for sale, and you can also have Ruth sign a copy of a book if you'd like. But without further ado, let me invite Ruth up to the lectern for a reading.
Wow. I've never done this before in a church in this beautiful, beautiful building. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good. Thank you all so much for coming. And Matt, thank you for inviting me to do this. I was very relieved to hear you describe the breadth and the height and the capaciousness of the Noble Lectures, because I have to say that I walked in and I thought, what am I doing here? You know, so we're going to test the capaciousness. We're going to test the capacity of the Noble Lectures. I hope tonight, and one of the things that one of the reasons I think that Matt and I sort of bonded was a kind of almost tribal sense of recognition of each other as being mixed race, of being Happa, right? Half Japanese, half Caucasian, American, whatever, white, and Duncan too is Happa, right? And yes, right, right? It's true. I know, right? I know. And so when I knew that Duncan was going to be in town, we kind of corralled him and thought it would be really wonderful to have a conversation between the 3 of us, because this is in many ways, my mixed race identity is really, really deeply sort of embedded in the work that I do. I mean, it's I write the way I write because I am mixed race, and I've only started to understand this. I've only started to understand how important this identity has been for me. And so anyway, I thought, thank you for, creating a context where we can talk about these kinds of things. It's not something I can normally, it's not something I can normally investigate and do. So I'm just really excited and happy about this. So we thought tonight, that we'd start with just a little bit of a reading from the Book of Form and Emptiness. And it's my most recent novel, published about 2 years ago. Time has stopped behaving the way it's supposed to behave after the pandemic. I no longer can count years the way I used to. But it was published 2 years ago. And it's a book, I think of it very much as a kind of pair or as a sibling to the book that I wrote just previous, A Tale for the Time Being. So the two books are I think very heavily influenced by Zen practice. I wrote them. I'd been practicing Zen for quite a while, and I think that the Zen practice that I was doing, again, just really informed both the stories as well as the way the books are written. So, do you like being read to? Yeah? Okay, good. Just kind of pretend that you're in your pajamas and get cozy. Good. In the beginning. A book must start somewhere. One brave letter must volunteer to go first, laying itself on the line in an act of faith, from which a word takes heart and follows, drawing a sentence into its wake. From there, a paragraph amasses, and soon a page, and the book is on its way, finding a voice, calling itself into being. A book must start somewhere, and this one starts here. A boy. Shh, listen. That's my book, and it's talking to you. Can you hear it? It's okay if you can't, though. It's not your fault. Things speak all the time, but if your ears aren't attuned, you have to learn to listen. You can start by using your eyes, because eyes are easy. Look at all the things around you. What do you see? A book, obviously. And obviously the book is speaking to you, so try something more challenging. The chair you're sitting on, the pencil in your pocket, the sneaker on your foot. Still can't hear? Then get down on your knees and put your head to the seat, or take off your shoe and hold it to your ear. No, wait. If there are people around, they'll think you're mad, so try it with the pencil first. Pencils have stories inside them, and they're safe as long as you don't stick the point in your ear. Just hold it next to your head and listen. Can you hear the wood whisper, the ghost of the pine, the mutter of lead? Sometimes it's more than one voice. Sometimes it's a whole chorus of voices rising from a single thing, especially if it's a made thing with lots of different makers. But don't be scared. I think it depends on the kind of day they were having back in Guangdong or Laos or wherever. And if it was a good day at the old sweatshop, if they were enjoying a pleasant thought at the moment when that particular grommet came tumbling down the line and passed through their fingers, then that pleasant thought will cling to the whole. Sometimes it's not so much a thought as a feeling, a nice warm feeling, like love, for example, sunny and yellow. But when it's a sad feeling or an angry one that gets laced into your shoe, then you better watch out, because that shoe might do crazy shit, like marching your feet right up to the front of a Nike store, for example, where you could wind up smashing the display window with a baseball bat made of furious wood. If that happens, it's still not your fault. Just apologize to the window. Say, "I'm sorry" to the glass. And whatever you do, don't try to explain. The arresting officer doesn't care about the crappy conditions in the bat factory. He won't care about the chainsaws or the sturdy ash tree that the bat used to be. So just keep your mouth shut. Stay calm. Be polite. Remember to breathe. It's really important not to get upset, because then the voices will get the upper hand and take over your mind. Things are needy. They take up space. They want attention, and they'll drive you mad if you let them. So just remember, you're like the air traffic controller. No, wait. You're like the leader of a big brass band made up of all the jazzy stuff of the planet, and you're floating out there in space, standing on this great garbage heap of a world with your hair slicked back and your natty suit and your stick up in the air, surrounded by all the eager things. And for one quick, beautiful moment, all their voices go silent, waiting till you bring your baton down. Music or madness, it's totally up to you. The book. So, start with the voices then. When did he first hear them? When he was still little? Benny was always a small boy and slow to develop, as though his cells were reluctant to multiply and take up space in the world. It seemed he pretty much stopped growing when he turned 12, the same year his father died and his mother started putting on weight. The change was subtle, but Benny seemed to shrink as Annabelle grew, as if she were metabolizing her small son's grief along with her own. Yes, that seems right. So perhaps the voices started around then too, shortly after Kenny died? It was a car accident that killed him. No, it was a truck. Kenny O was a jazz clarinetist, but his real name was Kenji, so we'll call him that. He played swing mostly, big band stuff at weddings and bar mitzvahs and in campy downtown hipster clubs where the dudes all wore beards and pork pie hats and checkered shirts and mothy tweed jackets from the Salvation Army. He'd been playing a gig, and afterwards he went out drinking or drugging or whatever he did with his musician friends, just a little toot, but enough so that on his way home, when he stumbled and fell in the alley, he didn't see the necessity of getting up right away. He wasn't far from home, only a few yards from the rickety gate that led to the back of his house. If he'd managed to crawl a bit further, he would have been okay. But instead, he just lay there on his back in a dim pool of light cast by the street lamp above the Gospel Mission thrift shop dumpster. The long chill of winter had begun to lift, and a spring mist hung in the alleyway. He lay there, gazing up at the light and the tiny particles of moisture that swarmed brightly in the air. He was drunk, or high, or both. The light was beautiful. Earlier in the evening, he'd had a fight with his wife. Maybe he was feeling sorry. Maybe in his mind, he was vowing to be better. Who knows what he was doing? Maybe he fell asleep. Let's hope so. In any case, that's where he was still lying an hour or so later when the delivery truck came rattling down the alleyway. And I think I'll stop there before anything really bad happens. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth.
Sure.
So just to kind of start this conversation, Duncan and I will both be asking you questions, and I hope it actually just becomes kind of a conversation.
I'm sure it will.
I'd like to start actually where you started before you gave your reading, which was the question of mixed race identity, which is something we were joking about, the three of us, just talking about our experiences. We come from different places and our different ages, and so we have different experiences, but also very recognizable experiences. And before I knew you, that sense of recognition I felt for your characters, and that's
Yeah.
what drew me to your fiction in many ways.
Yeah.
But I also know that there's more going on in your fiction than just that shock of recognition or the idea of recognizing characters that feel like me in some way. That's something about the multiplicity of identity or instability of identity is at stake in a broader and more central way in your writing. And I wonder if you would just say something more about that.
Sure, sure. It's a big topic, and it's a very Buddhist topic, I think. Well, let me just back up a little bit. I made it. Well, let me back up a little bit more. This is a problem. It's recursive, right? You just keep going backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards. It took me a long time to understand how to write a novel, because precisely for that reason, the novels that I grew up reading were all written from, usually by white men or white women from a very kind of Eurocentric position. And when I was a kid, I mean, I think Woman Warrior was published when I was in my 20s, and Joy Luck Club was published when I was in my 30s. I just didn't have any reference point here. And so it took me until I was in my late 30s to even start to write my first novel, My Year of Meats. And I remember starting to write that and thinking that really wanting to have, sort of feeling compelled to have a white protagonist in that role. But the character was a documentary filmmaker who was kind of straddling two countries, straddling Japan and the US. And so it just made sense. It made racial sense for the character to be mixed race like I am. And I resisted that at first because because I thought that everyone would think she was me, right? There's something about the specificity of being mixed race that means that you can't hide, right? I mean, it's I think, not, if a white male author, for example, writes a book, and the protagonist is a white man, readers aren't immediately going to think that protagonist is the author, right? That this is an autobiographical book, right? But if you're mixed race and you write a character who's mixed race, then everybody's going to be like, oh yeah, right, well, this is clearly an autobiographical novel. And this is why in that novel, I knew people were going to do that, so I made that character 6 feet tall and gave her green hair so that people could tell us apart, right? I kind of turned it into a joke. But at that point, I mean, so I wrote that, and I survived. Although even my best friend called me Jane at one point, who is the character's name. But at that point, I kind of decided that, well, I should just own it, right? I should just own this and investigate it. And so the next book, too, had a mixed race protagonist, and that's continued throughout all of the books. I think that in a way, it is a way of kind of, one of the things that concerned me early on was that if I wrote about mixed race protagonists, precisely because of this the identifying with, the relatability of the character, I hate that, the whole idea that a character needs to be relatable. But it is what we kind of, gravitate towards in fiction. And so what I was afraid of is that if I was writing from a mixed race, character's point of view, that it would limit the readership, right? That people wouldn't be able to relate to that character. And of course, what I found out is that that's completely not true, and I had to write it and experience it to understand this. But, we're all the offspring of two parents, right? I mean, we're all mixed race in some way, right? We're all mixed in some way. And so, what I discovered was that, in fact, it simply, it wasn't a problem at all, and that people did relate to it. And that to me, from a Buddhist perspective, underlines my belief, which is that that we're all far more alike than we are different, right? And that we are far more related, that we are kind of inextricably related to each other. So anyway, that's how it evolved, and it's. I wonder if I'll continue to do it. I think I probably will. I still can't imagine writing from a singular point of view. Yeah. So.
Yeah. It's interesting when you speak about writing from a single point of view, right? A lot of your fiction also moves from perspective to perspective. And I've heard you say in other contexts that the Western novel tends to have the kind of God's eye view, omniscient narrator as its dominant perspective. Interestingly, just from the Christian tradition, that's not how our scripture looks. There are 4 gospels told 4 different ways, right? That multiplicity is already embedded in our tradition as well. But I think that's really fascinating. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
I have one more question, then I'll maybe ask Duncan to ask some questions. One of the things that I really admire about your writing, and this is not just your fiction, but also your filmmaking, is sort of your willingness to look directly at suffering, right? To not turn your gaze away from suffering, to hold suffering under the gaze of your writing, your attention. And I think that's true in many ways, in many forms of suffering that you engage in your fiction, but also, especially in the last couple of novels, with respect to mental angst and mental illness. And I just want to say anything more about that.
Sure. Well, here again, I think there's such a parallel between the Buddhist teachings and the project of literature, in that the first noble truth of that the Buddha taught was the truth of suffering, right? That we all suffer, and suffering in this case, it can be big, capital S, suffering, but it can also be kind of anxiety. It can be kind of discontent. The word in Sanskrit is dukkha, and it can be translated, in different ways. And so we all do, we're all kind of just uncomfortable with the way things are, and we'd prefer them to be otherwise. And this, of course, that's the kind of the small suffering, and then the small letter suffering, and then there's the capital S suffering as well. But my point here is only that when you think about literature, right, I challenge you to think of one novel that doesn't have suffering at its core, right? I mean, if anybody can think of one, I'd love to hear it. So I think that the first noble truth of literature is also, the truth of suffering. And so the two projects are not as dissimilar as they might seem. Now, of course, I could just be justifying. This could all just be a justification for my bad writing habit, because in Zen there's a kind of tradition of disparaging the written word, right? That our realization should be kind of nonverbal, and it should be direct, and it should, not, transmitted through, words and letters and scripture, but, that it should be a direct experience. So, Zen Buddhists are always apologizing for their writing habit, and so I belong to that. I belong to that lineage. But so I think the reason that in the last two books, certainly the protagonists are both young people who are struggling with mental health, mental illness, and the reason that I write is exactly that, to examine some kind of suffering. And to really look at it. I mean, it takes me a long time to write books. These last 2 books, I think it was about 8 years for each of them, right? So that's a long time to really investigate this. And I've found that if I don't have a project, if I don't make something into a project, then I do ignore it, right? And so in a way, I think that with these 2 books, I really wanted to look back on my own past and understand why it was that I was so damn unhappy when I was a young person, right? And why it was that when I was 16, I was, having all sorts of suicidal thoughts. So that's something that I was able to kind of share with my protagonist in A Tale for the Time Being. Like Benny, I've had voice hearing experiences, and so that was something that I wanted to try to understand. What is that? What is it? What is it to have, a perplexing and unshared experience that cannot be corroborated, from the outside? And voice hearing is certainly that. But then again, so is novel writing. Until I write them, it's an unshared paradox, perplexing, experience. So it's kind of, there's a similarity there too. Anyway, the idea of sort of taking these parts of oneself and really, exploring them through fiction is a way of kind of creating a container for that kind of self-examination. And of course, in the tradition that Duncan and I practice in, Soto Zen, the founder of Soto Zen, Dogen Zenji, who was, by the way, a very prolific writer. So I feel like there's a precedent there. But I'm thinking about Genjo Koan.
Genjo Koan, it makes me think, actually this is my sermon on Sunday will be based on some verses from the text that Ruth just cited, but it begins with, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. And the second line is, to study the self is to forget the self. And then the third line, to forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But is it okay if
Of course, please.
Let me start there, because you alluded to the practice of writing, your practice of Buddhism, how those 2 things are adjacent to each other, meet sometimes, and so forth. And I wondered if you could, to go back to Matt's original question about mixed race, because for me, all these 3 things are kind of interlinked, So, for example, when I was growing up in Japan, I couldn't quite fit in because I don't look Japanese enough. My name's weird, Duncan Williams. But then I went to the UK. I couldn't fit in there either. Yeah. And so I grew up feeling not quite belonging anywhere in between cultures and languages and even religion, because my mom's Buddhist and my dad's British, so he's Anglican, Church of England. So I go to St. Albans Church in Tokyo and also to temple, and kind of being in between 2 different things. And then for me, when I was thinking about becoming a Buddhist priest, the idea of the middle path, that in between, that the liberation is not found on any one side, but in between, that was somehow one way I didn't, how should we say, have to choose any, I could embrace everything by being in the middle. And so I wonder if you could, and maybe Matt too, if you could say anything about the fact of being mixed race, then it causes for me that very first question in Genjo Koan, who am I?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that investigation leads to the study of Buddhism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could say anything about that journey, and maybe Matt too, like, as when you became, a clergy in the Christian tradition, how did your mixed race experience inform that?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you brought this up, the idea of the middle way, the middle path, because I think when I discovered that too, I mean, growing up, I always felt, sort of pulled in two directions in the same way that you describe, and, sort of at home in neither, in neither place, always, sort of in between somehow, right? And so the idea that there was, that there was a religious tradition that taught the middle way it came as such a relief and surprise, and it did, this feeling of being neither here nor there. Suddenly, there was something that was bigger than that, and that was more, to use another phrase from Dogen, this idea of being all-inclusive, right? That the path is, is enormously wide, right? And I'll just take a moment to note that was one of the themes that, was very much in this book, this idea of, what is normal, and the way that we define things as being very, very narrow, right? Our definitions of identity, for example, tend to be, we're very narrow. We focus on, it's sort of like the narcissism of small differences, right? It just gets very, very narrow. But, the idea of normal is a cultural construct, right? It's a fiction. We made it up. We made up this idea of what normal is. And that applies, I think, to race, too. And so if that's the case, why can't we expand since we made it up to begin with, why can't we just expand it to make it more all-inclusive, to make it, more generous and more compassionate, and big enough to embrace us all? And so these are the kinds of themes, I think, that that are very heavily kind of inflected by Buddhism, but that come from this very specific injunction to, study the self. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. And so it's such a profound teaching. And it's one that, I mean, if there was one teaching that I had to sort of cite as being, kind of the lamp for me, it's that. Right. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Matt, how about for you?
Yeah, I'd love to hear yours. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. My mom, when she married my dad, was baptized as a Christian, but she didn't have any anxiety about holding multiple religious identities, and I think that's a fairly, it's a trait that's unique to the Japanese. Yeah. I think I realized as a child early on that it was Christians around me in the relatively conservative Christian setting in which I grew up who were the ones who thought that one needed to choose.
Yeah.
But my mom didn't need to choose, right? And I realized that actually part of her practice was not having to choose, right? And so, for professional and other kinds of reasons, I have this kind of identity. I wear a collar on Sundays. I preach from that pulpit. I'm a Christian priest, and I hold that identity firmly. And I don't want to kind of pretend to a form of Buddhism that I don't hold, but I also hold the teachings of Buddhism, and especially my family's Shin Buddhism, very closely, and don't feel any anxiety when I'm in Japan, going to the family haka, the grave, and going through the rituals of my family, because that is also how I'm bound. And so I think that I think I also belong to, honestly, a Christian denomination that's fairly loose with doctrine, and so they're okay if I'm kind of ill-defined with these things. One thing I wanted to ask you also, Ruth, I mean, it's related to some of the things we've been saying about the relationship between identity and writing and practice, and your Buddhist practice in particular, is thinking about writing as a religious practice, or the relationship between writing and religious practice. At Harvard Divinity School, where I teach, we have a fairly interesting history of having fiction writers come and study, and in particular, there's a fiction writer named Chris Adrian, who's trained as a pediatric oncologist, and he's when he was already a published and fairly well-known novelist, he came to HDS to learn to be a chaplain. And it's because the work of hospital chaplaincy, he said, cultivated in him a kind of attention that helped his writing, and vice versa. That his writing also helped cultivate a kind of attention that he needed in serving as a chaplain. I wonder if you would be willing to speak about just how you think about your writing practice as a religious practice, or how your religious practice contributes to your writing practice. How do these things overlap, complement each other, build off each other?
Well, as I was saying earlier, too, for the longest time, I really felt that they were separate. That the writing practice, especially, it would be one thing if I was writing haiku or something, a kind of flash of poetry that's over, that's a flash of insight, and it's kind of, and then it's ephemeral, and, that seems more in the tradition of Zen. But I don't write that way. I'm very wordy, right? And I write these long, intricate, complicated novels. I mean, and these are the things that we're supposed to be letting go of, letting go of our stories, right? I don't. I do the opposite, right? I just make them more complicated and longer, and, so that was, I think, where I felt some kind of tension. But the more that I do it, the more I realize that there is no conflict there, and that the writing, and this, goes back to Dogen again. I hope, my understanding of Dogen, I say this because Duncan is a very well-trained Soto Zen priest. And so I'm always a little bit like, I hope I understand this right. But this, in other words, Japanese trained. Okay, let me make a distinction here. Duncan was trained in Japan, and I'm trained in the West. Okay, so and so there is a distinction, I think, that that is made on both sides. So this idea that what I'm thinking about is the idea of a Dharma position, right? The idea that that the reason that and tying that into what we discussed earlier, the idea of hongaku, or original enlightenment. Right, and so the idea in Zen that that when you practice Buddhism, when you sit, for example, when you practice meditation, that you're not practicing it in order to get something. Right, it's not outcome oriented. You're not striving for enlightenment. And let me make it, this is Soto Zen too, so it's, there's a distinction. There distinctions in the different schools. But in Soto Zen, the idea that you're not sitting Zazen for hours and hours and hours in order to achieve something or in order to get something. It's more that because we are all enlightened Buddhas originally, right? We are already enlightened. The Zazen that we're practicing is just simply an expression of our original enlightenment, right? And so, in other words, there's nothing to get, there's nothing to achieve. It's you sit Zazen because that's what enlightened people do. That's what Buddhas do, right? Buddhas sit Zazen, and so there's a subtle kind of turning there that relates to writing for me, in that of course, when I sit down to write, I want to finish a book, and I want, I'd like to finish a book, and then I would like to sell the book, and then I would, like it to be published, and, so there is that kind of outcome. But I don't focus on that when I'm writing. For me, when I'm writing, I am just writing, right? And so it's, there's a part of my mind that, of course, understands that, that there's this other project going on, the project of publication and stuff, but I'm not focused on that when I'm writing. I'm very much focused on, just sort of watching the book emerge, right? Following the book as it emerges. So it's a different kind of relationship there. And so the Zen practice has really helped me with that, has helped me kind of let go of that, that kind of outcome orientation in my writing as well, I think. And I think part of that is a kind of faith that that the book once it's finished, once it's out there, it'll be an expression of my Dharma position, my understanding of the Dharma at any particular moment, right? Which of course might change, right? But that's okay, right? Because that's the expression then. Right?
It reminds me a little bit of the idea that we, in the Buddhist tradition, we have Madhyamaka, which is about emptiness and debunking stories we tell about ourselves, about our world. And then Yogacara, which says our mind can create our world.
Yeah.
Our imagination are the stories we tell.
Yeah.
But the stories we tell, which are liberative, and stories we tell, which are not, make a huge difference.
Huge difference, yeah.
Right? So I wonder if I could ask you to reflect a little bit on, well, let me go back one step. When I was thinking of becoming a Buddhist priest, I was probably like 19, and I asked my teacher to be, I'd like to think about, I already have lay order, and then he's like, and he just slapped my head, and he was like, you don't know what you're talking about, go away. And then I kept to go back like 3 more times when I was 20, 21, and finally I became ordained 20. And he said, do you know what it even means to become a Soto Zen Buddhist priest? I knew this was a trap question. It's a Zen question. So I said, no, I don't know, please tell me. Because then you put it back in their court. Then he said, to be a Zen
You're
priest...
a tennis player. I can see this, right? This is the tennis coming out, right?
Then he said, to be a Buddhist priest means you will have no more holidays.
Yeah.
Then he took a moment, then he explained, and he said that one line in English. Okay? You will have no more holidays. Then he said, because when everybody else, New Year's, Obon, like everybody has holiday, it's the busiest time at the temple. And every day, somebody's worried about their young child, some temple member comes and wants to talk to you. You can't say, well, it's after, I won't talk to you. You have to, so he said, to put a robe on, it means, how can I help you? Right? So that task of our job is to alleviate as opposed to increasing sufferings, to decrease, alleviate it. So I wonder if you could just say a word about the role of stories and storytelling in alleviating suffering. Because I think that's another way we can frame what does it mean to be doing a Buddhist priest's work, and what does it mean to be doing a novelist's work.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Just all of these things kind of come to mind, but the first thing that I'll say is that certainly, the idea of writing a novel that will help rather than hurt is something that I take very seriously. It's not that I want the novel to be to be kind of propaganda for Buddhism. That would never work. And so when I'm writing, I'm very much writing for myself, right? But at some point, you do have to shift over into publication, understanding that this novel is going to go out in the world. And what does that mean? Is it, how is it going to, be of help in the world rather than hurting people? And so that is something I think about. And my understanding of that, of course, has changed over the years. But it's not something I think about right away. It's something I think about later on, sort of in edits. And because I think that if I know this, I have written things that that I feel, that I needed to write for some reason, but I would not put them out into the world. I wouldn't publish them, just because I feel that they're, that for whatever reason, it was something that I needed to do, but it was not something that I wanted to share necessarily. So that's very much part of it. The other thing that I was thinking about, though, is that, just one thing I think I'm conflicted by as a, as a Buddhist priest, as an ordained priest, is that, and this is where there is tension between writing and Zen, because, you can't really write novels when you're sitting zazen. Right, it's not a good idea to do that, right? I mean, I've done that, I have done that. My mind is, I'm sitting zazen and like I'm thinking all of these, and in other words, you can't really do both at the same time within a kind of linear time frame that we normally inhabit, right? And the other thing is that, it's true that there is a sense, I think, that when you put on a robe, you don't say no to people. You try to, you try to open your arms, right, and be available, right, and that also is challenging, because novelist's job is very solitary, right, and in order to write, I do need to, sort of shut myself off, and have, sort of vast amounts of unstructured time. In order to really drop down deep into the novel and keep all of the pieces, sort of juggling all of the pieces, of the novel. And so that is a conflict. That is a kind of conflict.
There's always a place for deep mountain hermitage.
That's right. That's right. And I kind of console myself that, if it really, I mean, that's why I live in Canada sometimes. I live in an area, a remote island in British Columbia, in an area called Desolation Sound, right? And so there's a reason for that, But I'm also thinking about the Japanese tradition of, and I think I've got this right, hijiri. Hijiki.
Hijiri,
right?
The mountain ascetics.
No, the hijiri, the entertainers, the entertainer priests, right? Isn't? I think it was
they
hijiri.
do both.
Yeah.
They go to the mountains.
Oh, okay.
And then they can do like performance arts and other kinds of storytelling.
That's me.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
That's it.
Go to the mountain and then come down from the mountain and then be the entertainer, kind of like a little bit like a clown, and then go back to the mountain again. Right. So that, I was so relieved when I heard about this. It was Stephen Hine who told me about that, right? And I just felt so relieved. It's like, yes, historical precedent.
So why don't we see if there are any questions from the audience? We have a couple of folks who will be floating around with microphones. So if you do have a question, please put up your hand and wait for a microphone to come to you, and then we can keep talking.
Yes.
So I'll be brave. Thank you. This has just been wonderful. My question is, if suffering is part of the book, are you thinking when you write it about how to make sure it's not depressing? Right, so people will still want to read it.
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm really trying to think whether I have those thoughts when I'm writing it. I don't have those thoughts when I'm writing it. When I'm writing it, I'm just writing it. Later in the edit, I'll make adjustments. And it's not so much about depressing. For some reason, that's not the nexus of my concern. And I think the reason is because I have my voice in these books is, there's a lot of humor in them, right? And so I think that, as a former Shakespeare person, scholar, not that I was an aspiring Shakespeare scholar. I really understood how tragedy and comedy are kind of flip sides of the same coin, and there's a reason why Shakespeare uses clowns in his tragedies, and I think this is also a very kind of Buddhist idea that of sort of no separation, non-duality, right? That tragedy and suffering tragedy and comedy are sort of flip sides of the same thing. And so I think my voice tends to, naturally hold suffering in a kind of middle way, right? But the thing that I do worry about is violence, and I have, I think this is something that I always think about, and I'm always struggling with. Our tolerance for violence has changed. Our tolerance for literary violence has changed, I think, since I was a young person, first reading novels. I think that that we've become more sensitive. And so and maybe it's just that I've become more sensitive, but I know that that I try very hard to. I mean, that some of the violence in the books, I think it's necessary, but I do work at that in order to, kind of. I don't want to say soften it, but to make it less. I just want to make sure that there is no gratuitousness about that violence, right? And so I really work that, and one of the things that I think happens when you're writing is that you go through so many stages with the material, and there are times when I'm writing that feel very, very raw, when I'm writing, say, a violent scene, or a scene of suffering. There are moments in that writing process, especially right at the beginning, where it does feel very raw, and I feel very sensitive to the material. But then, you read it maybe 200, 300 times, and your sensitivity changes, right? And so you're not the best judge by the end of whether something is over the top or not, right? And so this is where, having other people read it is necessary, because, one becomes, I'm not going to say one, I can become a little bit callous, a little bit too acclimated to my own, to my words, and I have to be careful about that. So, and that was something I don't think I realized in my first book, and there are some scenes in the first book that I probably would not write now, and I see that. But this goes back to Dharma position, right? I'm not the same person I was however many years ago that was, a long time ago. And that's a good thing, right? I mean, I'm glad of that. It's going to be very interesting, because I'm going to be re-recording the audiobooks for My Year of Meats and All Over Creation, my first two novels, and I wonder what's going to happen when I hit those scenes. Do
we have another question? Great.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. All of the talking about the balance of practice and writing, and it's just making me wonder about your calling as a Zen priest, and I just wanted to know a little bit more about that end of the story, why it's important for you to be in that world too, and what that work as a Zen priest brings to your life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's a question that I'm still trying to answer. I really don't have an answer for that, except that I, like you, I felt drawn to this. I felt drawn to the practice. I did lay ordination, and continued to be drawn. I just felt kind of drawn into it. And during this time, I think what started me taking practice really seriously was suffering, right? And it was when my parents started, they were old. I'm an only child. My mother was diagnosed with dementia. My dad was really sick. And it was right around that time, I realized oh, wow, this is all on me, right? And I didn't know how to do this. I did not know how to support them. And I did a terrible job at first. When my dad was dying, it was really tough. And I sort of vowed never to never to make those kinds of mistakes again. I knew that I needed the practice, right? And it helped me so much. And I think that's part of what drew me to it, was that I found that the Zen practice and the teachings and meditation and the whole Sangha, the support of the Sangha, helped me so much that I just wanted to be a chain in the link. I just wanted to be involved in this in a way that would allow me to, just kind of help the project of Zen somehow, right? And it wasn't that I was more explicit in my mind than that. I didn't really have any other, I just started to really understand. I mean, as I got older too, you start to understand succession, right? You start to understand that these teachings have to be passed down, right? And it's not something I would have realized as a young person, but as I get older, on so many different fronts, I'm realizing wow, there's work to be done in terms of passing the teachings on. And so I think it was that drew me to it. I can't kind of evaluate, I think I'm a pretty bad priest, if you want to know the truth.
Ruth, sometimes it's because we are not so good practitioners that we have to become a priest.
Right.
Have you noticed that?
Thank you.
No, I'm serious. I'm not. I used to do so much, but then I said, I have to go and lead the meditation. I don't really want to. But I'm the one with the role. I had better go. And then you do it.
Yeah.
And then you feel, okay, that was good. I did it.
Right.
But it's, sometimes, those of us who are on the weaker end of the whatever discipline or whatever, we need to have this role.
There's some members of my congregation here. You weren't supposed to say that part out loud. I think we have maybe time for one more question. There's a hand up here.
That is so great, Duncan. Finally, the mystery has been explained to me. Thank you.
Hi, Ruth. My name is Maya. Thank you so much for being here. It's really such a delight to hear this conversation. I really enjoyed A Tale for the Time Being, and the question that I came in with was actually about the fact that you have a character in that book named Ruth. And I was sort of curious about, it made me think of Maggie Nelson's Argonauts.
What's that again?
It made me think of Maggie Nelson's Argonauts, and sort of, I think
Maggie
in
Nelson's the Argonauts.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
I think you mention the character of Ruth, there's a passing thought about autobiographical fiction, maybe. I don't know, but it was interesting that you sort of started off talking about the way that you wanted to differentiate yourself from your main character, and so I was curious about that progression and. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's great. I did at the beginning want to differentiate myself, and as I said in the first book, this character Jane Takagi Little, I made her, I really wanted us to be different. Made her 6 feet tall, gave her green hair. We were very different, but still people confused us, right? And so in the second book, there was another mixed race character named Yumi. And my strategy in that case was to make her so dysfunctional, that nobody would dare, think that she was autobiographical. I also, I think, gave her 3 children. I mean, I really, and she was a terrible mother, and, and so I thought that would take care of it, but it didn't take care of it. People still thought that, it's like, oh, she must be autobiographical. And so then that, I think by the time the 3rd novel came around, part of it was that I just gave up. It's like, I'm just going to embrace this, right? But I have to say that it took a long time. I worked on that novel for 7 years, I think, before the Ruth character and the Oliver's my husband. It's also the husband of the Ruth in the book. We share a husband. And I resisted that for 7 years. I resisted putting myself in that book for 7 years. And well, you know the structure of the book. There's a young Japanese girl who is writing a diary, and she sends it, she's convinced that if she sort of sends a diary out into the world that somebody will pick it up and read it, but she doesn't know who that reader is going to be, and so neither did I, and so it was my job as the writer to figure out who the reader would be. At one point early on, I do have a note in my process journal that, I wonder if the reader is me. And I promptly threw that idea out for this reason. I just felt it was, and I also felt it was so metafictional and, just kind of, I didn't like the idea at all at the beginning. And so then for 7 years, I tried to find that character of the reader. And so the original drafts of the book were very different from the book that I finally ended up writing. I'll tell you, the first finished draft of the book had a reader there who had no name, who had no gender, who had no job, who lived in a library, had some friends in the library, but basically, and had a whole kind of assorted, a bunch of symptoms, kind of neurotic tics, okay? And that was it, right? And it wasn't a very, it was a terrible draft. It was really bad. But it was done, right? So I was really happy that it was done. And, because we're all so impatient. And so I was just about to turn it into my editor. I gave it to my agent, who agreed that it was terrible, right? And she said, well, let's just give it to Carol. Let's give it to your editor. Maybe she can help you fix it. And so we were just about to do that when the earthquake and tsunami happened, in 2011. And that was just one of those events that caused, it was so big. It caused a kind of rift in time, right? And in the same way that 9/11 did, in the same way that COVID did, right? There was the kind of pre-earthquake, pre-tsunami, pre-meltdown of Fukushima, Japan, and then there was this post-earthquake, tsunami, post-meltdown Japan, and they were different. And in the same way that after 9/11, writers were really struggling, especially New York writers, really struggling, because we didn't know how to write about New York anymore. New York was different, right? It was radically different. And there was all of those articles going around about the end of irony. Do you remember that? It's like, now that 9/11 has happened, we can no longer be ironic, which for New Yorkers is kind of a problem, right? And so people were really panicking about this. And for me too, I was just about to submit this book, and it was, the way I'd written it was kind of, it was clever, but it wasn't really very good. It was kind of very conceptual, very heady, and very kind of postmodern, and I'd convinced myself that all of that was okay, and it wasn't, but it wasn't okay in the pre-earthquake Japan, and it certainly wasn't okay in the post-earthquake Japan. It just was wrong. It did not, it just no longer was appropriate. And so that was a moment where, it was like, okay, I've been working on this damn thing for 8 years now. I can't publish it, right? And so I took it back, and then I sat with it for, for a couple of months, and that was when I was having this conversation with Oliver, who you know, and we were talking about this, and he pointed out, he said, the earthquake broke the world. It broke, the planet in a way, and it certainly broke the fictional world of my book. And the only way to move forward with this is to, and this idea about looking directly at something, the only way to move forward then is to allow that brokenness to exist, right? To allow that brokenness to persist. And the way that you do that, the way that you allow, a fiction to be broken, is to step into it yourself as a, character. And so that then if people read the book, they wouldn't know whether, there was always be that little bit of, brokenness, that little bit of sense that, is this real or is this fiction? Is this real or is this fiction, right? So there's a kind of seamlessness that has been destroyed there. The seamlessness of the fiction is no longer, there. And so this made sense to me, right? And it also, I realized would allow me to put the earthquake and tsunami and the meltdown at Fukushima into the heart of the book, right? And so I said, okay, Oliver, you're right, but if I'm going to be in the book, you have to be in the book too. and he's a good sport, so he agreed. and so that's how that happened, okay? But it took me years to get to the point where I could finally, just say whatever, step into the book, give the character my name, and own that, Now, I'm a lot smarter than her. She is a fictional character. She sold her New York apartment, right? Why would she do that? I still have mine.
That's going to conclude this part of our conversation. First, I just want to say thank you to Ruth for her generous and wise answers, as generous and wise as her writing. Let's all give her a round of applause for her.
Thank you.
I also, just some instructions. There are books for sale, and Ruth will be signing books in the memorial room here. So if you're interested either in having a book signed or purchasing a book for signing, please line up at the rear entrance, and then where Anna is back there waving. And then we'll make our way over and get set up, and we'll start the book signing in just a few minutes. Thank you again for coming tonight, and thank you again to Ruth and Duncan for the conversation.
And thank you, guys. Yeah, thank you.